In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. Hello and welcome to Eastern Sunrise. I'm your host, Somaya Mortazavi, and it's a real pleasure to have you with us. Eastern Sunrise tries to discuss and look into Islamic civilization in Southeast Asia from its origins to today. We'll be hosting a number of well-established scholars and researchers in this field to explore the long and somewhat unknown history of Islam in the region and its influence in cultural, political, and social aspects in the lives of Southeast Asians. In the first program, we'll take a brief look at the arrival of Islam in the region. Okay, first of all, let me introduce my knowledgeable guest speaker today, Professor Dr. Karim Duglas Krou, Principal Research Fellow at the International Institute of Advanced Islamic Studies, Malaysia. His remit involves examining civilizational topics in terms of globalized trends within Muslim societies and their reciprocal relations with Euro-American cultures. Dr. Karim, welcome to our program.
Thank you, Somaya. It's a pleasure to be here on Eastern Sunrise.
Thank you so much. Hope we have a great discussion today. Okay. Doctor, the chronology of Islam's arrival in Southeast Asia is not known exactly. From at least the 10th century, Muslims were among the many foreigners trading in Southeast Asia, and a few individuals from Southeast Asia traveled to the Middle East for study. The actual timing and introduction of Islamic religion and religious practice to Southeast Asia is somewhat of a debate. European historians have argued that it came through trading contacts with India, whereas some Southeast Asian Muslim scholars claim it was brought to the region directly from Arabia to Middle East. And other scholars claim that Muslim Chinese who were engaged in trade introduced it. Dr. Karim, could you please kindly put us in a picture of Islam's gateway to the Southeast Asia?
Yes, you mentioned three of the most commonly held views. They don't necessarily contradict each other. There's no doubt that there was east-west trade by maritime means, boats, from southern Arabia around the peninsula of Indian subcontinent directly into Southeast Asia. They would have hit close on the coast of Malacca and or Aceh, which are the two most accessible areas when you come into the part of the Indonesian archipelago. At the same time, overland routes were certainly important. We can see from the architecture of the early Islamic mosques in Sumatra and in Java and in the Malaysian peninsula, that there was a Chinese influence. There was no doubt about that. Also, it seems that there was, later on, after the 11th, 12th century, there was a direct Iranian influence. There was a famous center, trading and cultural center called Shahre-No, which is now accepted to be in what is Thailand. And local scholars from the Javanese and Sumatran and Malaysian peninsulas would go to that area for education. There's also the high incidence of Iranian loanwords in the Malay language, which is more than an accident. And so it's undoubtedly clear that there were more than one means. And we can see this also, besides the evidence of linguistics, we can see the evidence of the racial mixing. If you see a country like Aceh, which was a maritime empire, It had connections between Mecca and China. And it had relations with the Chinese emperor and later on with the Ottoman emperor.
Correct.
And it had a trade empire. It was the biggest dealer of pepper and spices in the world. Even as late as the 19th century, there were boats going from Boston in New England, North America, directly to Aceh to buy pepper. It was one of the biggest products sold, as well as camphor, another very important medicinal substance used especially in traditional Chinese medicine, and others. So the maritime commerce was created an interconnected realm which, so to speak, tied together the underbelly of the Asian world, which was populated by Muslims. From South Arabia to the coastlands of India, to the southern coastlands of Iran, all the way over to the Southeast Asian peninsular islands, and to China. So this is a whole realm of culture and interchange. And
it backs to which century?
Well, we're talking from the 12th century on. Recently there was a boat wreck, a shipwreck discovered off the coast of Indonesia, which is dated earlier than any other physical remains that we know of Muslim presence in Southeast Asia. They found on board, apparently it sank in a storm and it had a full cargo of goods which they hadn't yet delivered. They had Chinese pottery ware, Persian pottery ware, and goods from mainland Asia and Iran and Pakistan area. So these were the kind of things that were being traded. Foodstuffs and precious products, cloth and household wares.
Right.
Actually, the Chinese market, the Chinese provided the market in the Middle East for household wares from a very early period. We'd like to point out that we have had the intercontinental trade due to the two main monsoon wind periods. And this blows east and then west at different times of the year. These are mentioned in the Quran, by the way. And there was probably ancient Arab contact with India, if not beyond, already in the period before the time of the Prophet Muhammad. So this is to be kept in mind. There have been Indian communities in South Arabia for well over 1400 years. And you can find them today in Yemen, by the way.
Correct.
So one other indication, the so-called futa, the wraparound dress for males and women in Southeast Asia, which is a traditional form of clothing. The same item of dress is worn in Yemen, by the way, which is also another indication. Beyond the trade, though, what you have is a cultural mix. You have Muslim societies sending out merchants and traders from Iran, from Arabia, maybe coming down from the north, from China, coming into this part of the world where there was largely a Hindu-based culture. In Sumatra, there was an important Buddhist kingdom, Srivijaya, related to Tibetan Buddhism, by the way. And there was a mingling. The Muslim presence came through the coasts, through the ports. They had a commercial purpose that was to make a profit and to trade. And they also had the moral duty of spreading their own form of faith. And they did it in a peaceful manner. And trade and intercourse through commerce is the best way to influence each other. And ideas come through trade. But what's interesting is to see how they chose a certain colloquial language and invested it with the concepts at the heart of the Islamic teaching. Instead of coming in, you have the Javanese language, which is a high language based on Sanskrit. They chose a vernacular language, the Malay, which was the language spoken in the ports among the mixed populations. And they chose that and they made it the written language of the Malay culture, the Malay peoples throughout Southeast Asia, in what is now mainland Malaysia, in Indonesian islands, in Philippines and in South Thailand. All of these are the same people. Cumulatively, they constitute today about 250 million people.
Okay.
Who are the Malay people who speak the Malay language. The second largest group of Muslims by ethnic and linguistic category after the Arabs. People tend to forget this, that after the Arabs, the Malays are the second largest group of Muslims, especially because, of course, Indonesia is such a populous nation. I think the recent 230 million people,
above
235.
million, yeah.
Every year it seems to go up 5 million. It's very quick. Nevertheless, they chose this language and invested it with the high concepts of Arabic. And from an early period in the 14th century, Hamza Fansuri, the great Achinese poet, who, by the way, was educated in Shahre-No, in what we think today is southern Thailand. And he, in his mystical ideas and in his court presence, was a very important figure for creating a whole new literature, a whole new language, and a whole new body of meanings. The meanings came from the Quran and the Hadith and the high teachings of Islamic culture. These were the, so to speak, intellectual and spiritual components that were blended in with the local culture.
Correct.
Now, we have to remember, of course, that it was a tolerant and a relaxed way of bringing Islam. It did not seek to uproot and to replace. It sought to blend and to harmonize. Many of the local patterns of life, the habits and preferences, what in Malay they call adat, the customs, were kept in place. Some of them are not necessarily the same as what one finds in the central Islamic lands like Iran or Iraq or the Arab world. For example, there was a lot more liberal attitude towards how women dressed. There wasn't this insistence on covering in public as you find it in other parts of the Islamic world. However, that changed in the 19th and 20th centuries, as we'll see in a while. So the other thing is the mingling of cultural elements in the architecture, in the art. You see this in the cloth patterns. You see this in the mosque architecture with the triliteral split roof, which is derived from a Chinese model. There are many famous mosques in China now which have the exact same roof style. You'll see them. And also the intellectual breadth, because there was a true bringing together of East and West. The Emperor of China had commercial relations with the great sultans of the Southeast Asian islands. If you go to Banda Aceh there, you'll see what they call the Chakradunya, which is a large bell given as a gift by the Chinese emperor in the 17th century to the leading sultan, Iskandar Muda, whom they called Pahlavan, the hero. And he was a very powerful leader who united most of Sumatra and parts of the coast of Java and of Malaysia in one empire.
Right.
He had a treaty with the Sultan in Istanbul, the Ottoman Sultan. And there were Ottoman Navy ships that used to come to his ports here in Aceh and in Pasar and Padai, other ports of North Aceh. Right. And this is one of the tremendous accomplishments of Islamic civilization. The maritime empires that subsisted on trade, and at the heart of their enterprise was this coexistence and exchange with other peoples. Chinese, Hindu, Buddhist, and then later, of course, the white man came on the scene.
Okay, we will continue on this discussion. Stay with us.
An appreciation of Islam's spread in Southeast Asia necessitates a review of the historical context in which this advance occurred. The nature of the sources, however, makes it impossible to answer the most fundamental questions about the arrival of Islam in Southeast Asia. In the first place, there is no way of knowing exactly when and where the first significant local conversions occurred. Existing evidence suggests that it was, such as in Aceh in northern Sumatra, closest to the Indian and the Islamic heartlands where Islam established its first beachheads. The evidence for the existence of local Muslim communities does not emerge until the late 13th century CE, although there may well have arisen earlier than this. The Venetian traveller Marco Polo mentions Muslims in Perlac in 1292, and in neighbouring Pasai, a royal gravestone inscribed with the date 1297 and the Muslim title Sultan Malik al-Salih has been found. European historians have argued that Islam came to Southeast Asia through trading contracts with India. The known strength of the Indian trading presence in Southeast Asian waters at a time when Islam began to move into the region is convincing evidence for the role of Indian Muslims in the diffusion of Islamic ideas. Strong arguments have been advanced in favor of Gujarat, Bengal, and the Muslim areas of southern India, all of which had strong trading ties with Southeast Asia. However, some Southeast Asian Muslim scholars claim it was brought to the region directly from Arabia in the Middle East. They argue that Southeast Asian peoples came into direct contact with Muslim traders who had been not just to India but also to Arabia and Persia. Arabic and Persian scholars also came to Malaysia and Indonesia, facilitating information about the new religion. Other scholars claim that Muslim Chinese, who were engaged in trade, introduced it.
Doctor, let's go to the 14th century. There is a theory that some scholars believe that Cheng Ho, he was the Chinese admiral who brought Islam to this region. Can you discuss more about it?
It has become quite significant recent discoveries and studies. There's no doubt that the Chinese naval fleets that were equipped to go long distance and had the scientific expertise to navigate and to construct maps, by the way, were intended to forge a giant trade network with China at the middle. In the early 15th century, one of the emperors began to divert a large amount of resources to this project. It cost a lot of money, so to speak. They had advanced ports. One of them was in Aceh, what is now Aceh in North Sumatra, and in the Malaysian peninsula. And they would re-equip their fleets and stock up on supplies at those ports. So Islam may have been reinforced by the presence of these Chinese fleets, but the fleet was not there to convert people to Islam. It happened that the admirals and the naval captains of the fleets were eunuchs owned by the emperor who happened to be Muslim and of Turkic origin.
Right.
And they, a very special class, these eunuchs in the Chinese hierarchy. And there's quite a controversy about them too. And from there they set out, they went to India and Africa and Europe, and apparently, according to some interpretations, it seems that they discovered the continents of North and South America, and that they mapped from the North to the South Poles. So the first world map might have been constructed by them, but this is denied by some people. They think it's too early. Nevertheless, the point is that there were always important naval and maritime exercises and initiatives which promoted the spread of cultures and civilizations. And Islam was in the middle of all of that. The more ordinary type of trade, the long-distance trade of goods through naval vessels that reach Southeast Asia, to the coasts of India, to the South Arabian and East African coasts, this is very old. And it doesn't have to wait till Cheng Ho comes for people to have these kind of exchanges.
It's so complicated, the history of Islam in this region.
Let me tell you a story, Sumaya.
Okay.
A couple of years ago, I was on the beach in Aceh. Aceh is in the northernmost west part of Sumatra. And there was a fishing boat, and they were fixing it. And I asked the fisherman, I said, how far can you go? He said, well, sometimes we go out to fish, and the wind takes us, and we wind up on the coast of India, near Chennai.
Really?
I said, I don't believe that. Then a lawyer happened to be there with him. He said, yes, I'm involved in getting 6 of the Achenese sailors out of jail from Chennai because they arrest them, they don't have papers, and they think they're smugglers. So this happens, it's not uncommon. It's not that far away. Yeah, it shows you, when you look at the map from the South Pole perspective, and you see the bottoms of the continents, South Arabia, India, Southeast Asia, you see how close they are by road. It's very easy to get to them. Yeah. But the other way, of course, is that people can arrive in that region who don't belong and who are not willing to interact and intermingle and become part of the scene. This was the case with the Europeans. We're talking first, of course, is the Portuguese, who reached Malacca in what is now South Malaysia. And of course, then the Dutch, followed by them soon after, within a century, and the English, the British. And this inaugurated the beginning of the modern age in Southeast Asia and the interaction of Muslims in those societies with the powerful and dominant European forces. And that's a whole nother story. But in some ways, it also hastened the way that Islamic identity was conceived and constructed among the communities of Southeast Asia. I mentioned before that there was an openness and tolerance among the Muslim societies towards pre-Islamic elements, Hindu and even Buddhist and native, pagan, animist, and with the Islamic veneer of culture. Many Indonesians, you see, their names are made of Sanskrit words. Right. You see many customs in Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines of the Malay peoples that go back to deeply rooted older traditions and habits. But they've been Islamized, they've been integrated into the Islamic scheme. But now, with the imposition of a European presence for exploitation, we're talking imperialism, of course, right. There was a tendency for the Muslims, first of all, to react to the intrusion. It was not just an economic and military intrusion. It was a cultural invasion. And this was part of the story of modernity, how all of the globe became united under one dominant economic system, capitalism, and was led by the main military and economic forces, the European, now of course the American. They've replaced Europe as the main, so to speak, imperial force in the world. And the response invoked by the Muslim populations might point out, of course, that there were rivalries among the Dutch and the British, the two main colonial powers. They were looking for the rich spices and gold and products of the islands and the mainland of Southeast Asia, which were necessary for their production. But they also needed markets to sell their goods because of the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the capitalist system, which saw their need to export their products to willing populations who were subjugated by them in India and China and Southeast Asia and the Middle East countries. Right. And so this was a system that tied the world together economically, where before it had been geographically separated by continents, more or less. Right. And more than that, it imposed a cultural veneer or uniformity of administration, of business, and of politics, which was done from the generosity of the white man on the other races. And there's no doubt that despite the exploitation, the European penetration helped promote a congruent, converging modernity for the rest of the world. Without the colonization by the Europeans, probably large parts of the world would still be much more medieval than they are now. We have to admit that. I mean, it was the British who built the train system that united India. Just a couple of years ago, the Indians finally succeeded in building the road system that unites their country. Since independence, it took them decades to finish that task. But without the railroad that the British had put in, it would be very hard to rule India and make it one united country. You see, these are the benefits. On the other hand, the other side of the European intrusion is that it robs you of your soul. Do you know what I mean, Sumaya? It substitutes for your identity the identity which is constructed and preferred by the master. That is the white man. And
in terms of Islam, it is so interesting that the Southeast Asian people embraced Islam with no force, with no war.
That's right.
This is an important point.
It was a natural process. That's absolutely correct. And unlike perhaps the experience in the initial Muslim spread and expansion in the 7th century after the death of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, where there was a lot of military activity and conquest and several empires disappeared The ancient Persian Empire no longer existed after that. But with the osmosis, the slow spread, the seepage through business, trade, contacts, political exchange, etc., Islam became deeply rooted into this part of the world. Relatively later, let's say, than the Central Asian lands and the North African lands, but in the same way, for example, that Islam became part of the scene of Eastern Europe, which had to wait until the Ottoman era. Still, Islam has an authentic presence there. But as I said before, Islam achieved a united culture which brought together what is now divided among 4 or 5 nation states here. If you include Singapore and Brunei, it becomes bigger because these are the same people, the same language, the same race. And when you see a Muslim from southern Thailand, which is a hot spot, as you know, there's trouble there almost every day. Or you see a Muslim from the Mindanao region of the Philippines. Or you see a Muslim from Burma, the Arakan people. You'll see they look Malay. They're the same people. And their words are very similar. So this is one huge group of Muslims with a common culture. And they have a very deep tradition. They have a philosophical tradition. They have a mystical tradition which is tied with the teachings of Ibn al-Arabi, Sheikh al-Akbar, whose works were translated and known and studied in Aceh and in Malaysia for several centuries. They had ties with great Indian theologians and Sufis, Burhan Puri and others. They had ties with people from Central Asia and Iran. So we have to understand that the Southeast Asian Muslim community was not an isolated one which had peculiar local customs. It was part of the larger Muslim scene. It was part of the Ummah. It always was. But
as you have mentioned, more than 200 million.
Yes. I mean, if you know, for example, one of my students did their doctorate dissertation on a famous book by Abd al-Samad al-Palambani. He was a 18th century scholar who worked in Sumatra. Palembang is a town in Sumatra. He studied in Mecca. He came back, he wrote a sharh, a commentary on Ihya al-Din of al-Ghazali. But he wrote it in such a way that it became an encyclopedia of references by quoting hundreds of other Sufi works in explaining the text of Ghazali. Very interestingly, he had a classmate in Arabia, in Ta'if in Mecca. His name was Murtada al-Zabidi, who was the famous writer of the great Arabic dictionary, but also wrote a sharh of Ghazali's Ihya al-Din, and it's called إتحاف السادة المتقين في شرح إحياء علوم الدين, a famous book. The same kind of thing, an encyclopedia of Sufism, explaining Ghazali's text by quoting hundreds of other Sufi books, many of which we don't have anymore, have not survived. And these two men were classmates and colleagues. One of them wrote it in Arabic in Arabia, the other one wrote it in Jawi, the language in which Islamic Malaysian culture was written, in Sumatra, in the same era. This is a reminder for us of how common the culture was and how the interchange of ideas and cultures where the Malaysian world made a contribution to the mainstream Islamic world at the same time. Nowadays, of course, things have changed. In the modern age, you'd have to shift gears if we talk about that.
Okay, we'll be right back. Stay with us. Welcome back. Let's continue our discussion. Dr. Karim, the remarkable features of Islam and Southeast Asians to adapt a new situation is and paved the way of Islam into the region. Islam's success was primarily due to a process that the scholars term localization. by which Islamic teachings were often adopted in ways that avoided major conflicts with existing attitudes and customs. So, what was the indigenous religion before the entrance of Islam, and how well did they accept the new religion?
Okay, this localization process is a feature of the Muslim spread in many continents, not just in Southeast Asia. Here, of course, the peoples of this region come originally from the southern parts of China. Indonesia as a geographic creation was a relatively new entity that appeared because of the activity of volcanoes. We can say that a variety of religions had mingled their energies together. We have the indigenous, or if you call the word aborigine, I'd rather use the word original, customs and beliefs, with a matriarchal society where descent was through the mother. And you know, when you get married, the man goes and lives with the mother, with the wife's family, not the other way around. Islam is generally patriarchal, the man's system. But here in this part of the world, we have a matriarchal system at the heart of their culture. And then you have Hindu influence. India was always a major cultural factor in this part of the world. And you see this in the folk tales and in the linguistic aspects of many languages in Indonesia and Malaysia. And then you had a Buddhist influence as well. And then the Islamic influence. And now, in more recent times, of course, Christian, with the colonial presence.
And animism.
And, well, animism is originally part of the indigenous mix, right? Animism has to do with
Believed to a spirit.
Forces in nature which are believed in, you know. I remember going to Samosir Island in the middle of Lake Toba in Sumatra. And there they have people who were never converted to Christianity by the missionaries, and who never became Muslim. There's a huge tree in the middle of the island that they all go to and put things on and have certain beliefs about. They still can have preserved some of these animistic beliefs, but it's very rare, you know. On the other hand, one of the things about the Muslim presence is that it built on what was there. It didn't try to erase it. That's what I mentioned before when I said that there was a joining together of forces. The Malay language was a cultural medium. It was a popular language. It wasn't the language of the court and of the nobles and of the aristocracy, you know, like the Jawi languages, which had its own literature, by the way. But it was a spoken language and was a language of commerce and trade, so that it was the language which Muslims adopted and invested with their own conceptual depths and their own. They can translate the Quran into Jawi, the language of the Malay peoples throughout Southeast Asia, using the Arabic alphabet as the script with the addition of about 6 or 7 letters for the sounds that exist here which are not found in Arabic.
And we can find so many Arabic words in Malay language.
Yes, that's right. Malay language is at least 40% Arabic words, if you want, vocabulary.
40%.
Yeah, it could be even more, I'm not sure. And if you read Jawi, you will see that it's, you know, it's almost half understood if you know Arabic. It's just those remaining verbs and key nouns that need to be filled in.
Just the pronunciation is different.
Right. The Jawi script is also derived from Arabic. Arabic adopted its script to numerous languages throughout the Muslim sphere. Iran took it, Turks took it, you know, Urdu took it. You have various other local languages, but Malay became a lingua franca for all the peoples who were Islamized in Southeast Asia. Whether it was originally from the Indonesian region, it became the widespread language throughout. I mentioned the role of the missionary trader. There was also another kind of missionary who may not have been trading as such, but was a mystic or Sufi.
Right.
And there's the legend of the saints who came to the Java area and spread Islam. They are highly revered today, and their tombs are centers of visitation. They spread Islam to past the Sulu Sea into the southern Philippine islands, the Mindanao area. So there was a seepage of Islam and how it adopted to the local culture. Various local manifestations, aesthetic, artistic, and social, became embraced by Islam. We have the wayang kulit, the famous puppet show. All the characters in wayang kulit come from the Mahabharata, the famous Indian religious and historical text, which preserves the legends of Indian kings and the lessons that they provide, the stories of their deeds and their actions, which became moral examples for people.
Right.
So we have Muslim societies in Indonesia perpetuating a Hindu story in an aesthetic medium of the puppet show. The puppet show, by the way, was something that was known in other parts of the Muslim world.
Right.
In Turkey, you have Karagöz, and you have also the shadow show in Iran, not puppets, but shadow.
Yeah,
you
shadow.
know. So these are all parts of the indigenous artistic sense.
In the year 1590, Islamic writing appears in both Malay and Javanese scripts. This indicates a period of activity by Muslim scholars in select areas who were promoting Islamic beliefs. Rapid commercialization increased global trade that involved Southeast Asians in extensive travel outside their home areas. Animism, or the belief in spirits, was an intensely local religious form. It was difficult to perform rituals outside of one's own home area, since spirits, ancestral or otherwise, were not portable. The increased global trade influenced indigenous Southeast Asian traders in two ways. Firstly, they were attracted to new religious forms that were not tied to specific places. And secondly, they were impressed by the wealth and apparent materialistic power and talents of foreign traders. The successful spread of Islam in Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines owed much to the introduction of the Noble Quran and other Islamic books and references. Animistic beliefs, or those indigenous to Southeast Asia prior to the impact of Hindu or Theravada Buddhist beliefs, had no such written legacies.
How did crusade influence Southeast Asia in terms of bringing European biases to the region and affect people's attitude, values, and norms, and change the religious pattern of the region? What are the essential differences between Islam and Christianity in entering the region?
Well, you're asking a lot of big questions, Sumaya. Let's see. The Crusades
But
were
you're
a phenomenon
experienced
in the Mediterranean regions in the 800 years before. But what you're talking about is how Christianity was brought to Southeast Asia on the heels of the colonial domination.
Right.
And there's no doubt that part of colonialism had to do with an attempt to implant Christianity. You know, when people dominate you and are militarily and economically stronger than you, they tend to be seen as superior, the way the white man was viewed or viewed themselves as better than other peoples, because they had more wealth and they had more power. Therefore, they had to be better, right? On the other hand, the fact that their religion was Christianity was often confused or mistaken to be an indication that Christianity is a better religion. And that was an assumption that the colonial powers made. Whether they systematically tried to implant Christianity, you can look around and see in Southeast Asia. Who among the indigenous peoples who were here before the white people arrived have become Christian? Mainly Indian and Chinese. Have the Malay Muslim people become Christian? Hardly any. You can count them on the finger of one hand, perhaps. There are a few of the tribes in Java which were used by the Dutch. But, you know, it was a phenomenon that has always been noted around the world under the colonial presence. Converting the local Muslims is next to impossible. It just doesn't happen very much. And it didn't happen in Southeast Asia. But what happened was the displacement of a number of other indigenous religions. For example, most of the Taoists today in Singapore and in Indonesia have become Christian. Chinese religion has suffered more by the white man than by the Muslim presence, actually. But to talk about the differences between Muslims and Christians, you need another show for that, Sumaya.
In that time flies, yeah?
Yes.
Dr. Karim, thank you for joining us. And to our wonderful viewers, thank you. And see you next time in another edition of Eastern Sunrise. Till then, bye.